I just want to begin by acknowledging that I am presenting from, and the museum is built on, land that is the unceded and ancestral homeland of the Lenape people, referred to as the Lenape Hoking. I respect the past, present, and future of the Lenape people, both here and in the diaspora. The museum was also built on Seneca Village, which was a historically African-American community that was violently displaced in the construction of Central Park. So the talk that I'm going to give today is a pretty informal talk, and it's really an introduction to the region that I have been researching for about 10 years now, ever since I started playing the instrument that I play, which is called the kora. So a little bit about myself. As Jason mentioned, I'm a musician from New York City. I come from a musical family. So on the bottom right corner, you can see a photo of me with my father. In the middle here, who is a free jazz musician specializing in double reed horns. With his ensemble, I perform frequently with him, and also my brother, who specializes in Latin percussion. So I have been performing for many, many years. I started playing kora 10 years ago. And in this top right hand photo, you can see me in Dakar at a Nelson Mandela tribute in 2013. After living in Dakar for 3 years, I moved to London, where I studied at the School of Oriental and African Studies for my master's. And I have been living in New York, my hometown, for the past 4 years, where I'm studying at Columbia. My specialty is in the Mandé region. So the Mandé region refers to the geographical shadow of the Mandé Empire, which was one of the most prosperous kingdoms, not only in sub-Saharan Africa, but in all of human history. And if we compare a map from 1200 to 1400 AD to that in present day, we can see that the Mandé Empire included Mali, Guinea, Guinea-Bissau, the Gambia, and Senegal. And so it's kind of treated as a cultural and regional bloc with a lot of different linguistic and cultural similarities. However, the Mandé Khan, which is the many groups that were present in the Mandé Empire, amount to at least 47 different ethnic groups. So when we talk about Mandé music, when we talk about Mandé people, we're talking about actually an extremely diverse group of people, each with their own cultural, social, and linguistic particularities. However, because of the prosperity of the Mandé Empire and just the kind of moment in time that the Mandé Empire existed, it did have a widespread impact across what's known as the Mandé Khan, so the people of Mandé. And most notably, it solidified a caste system in which you had several groups with several different roles that we still see remnants of cross-ethnically today. Just a note on language in this presentation, will be using terms from Maninka, also known as Malinke, which refers to the Malinke people, who you can see here. It's a very similar language to Mandinka and is closest to the dominant language spoken at the time of the Mandé Empire. Wherever I do not use Maninka in order to refer to something ethnically specific, I'll make sure to let you know what language I'm using. So ethnomusicologist Eric Cherry has written really the authoritative text on Mandé music titled Mandé Music. And in it, he names 4 kinds of musicians in the Mandé world. So Soralu, or singular Sora, which are hunter musicians. Jeliw, or singular Jeli. These are often referred to in Western languages as griots. Drummers, and then modern musicians. So as you might be able to tell from the quotations, I'm not necessarily extremely thrilled about these categories. I do think they are useful for thinking about very pervasive themes in how people make music. However, of course, the first three categories could very much fit into the fourth category. Hunter musicians, jeliw, drummers, they're all modern day musicians. They're all practicing today. So there's a lot of overlap between these categories. Some other possible categories that we might include are numulu, or blacksmiths, farmers, and religious singers, which for a variety of reasons have been relatively ignored within the larger scholarship on this region, although they're beginning to receive more attention, notably in the work of Scott Linford, who works on the accounting, which is very, very close to agricultural music making, which includes music about making the rain come and crops grow and about marking the time of day, and religious singers, which haven't received as much attention in part because the religions that they practice in this region is not necessarily seen as indigenous. So those religions are Islam and Christianity. And so it's seen as something brought in from the outside. However, those music practices associated with those religions are done in particular ways in the region and have had particular influences on the aesthetic qualities of the music. And furthermore, you do have particular groups like Baifals in Senegal that have very specific musical traditions that are tied to worship that are very much of the region. So this is just to give you an idea of the sort of diversity of music making that occurs in this region. All of that said, I will be focusing on jeliw today, singular jeli, for several reasons. So first, jeli practices are my expertise. This is what I have focused on the most in my own music practice, but also in my research. Second, they are perhaps the most recognizable and widely circulated outside of the West African context, which is to say that if you are seeing a presentation of Mandé music today on a world music stage, it is most likely some kind of jeli. And that might be something ethnically different, but most of the time, this is the kind of music we are seeing from this region outside of the region. And third, there's the most literature on this category of musician. And so, I can share much more information with you about these musicians than any other category here. But I do want to draw your attention to the ways in which that focus on jeli is actually perhaps a reflection of our Western biases when we approach these non-Western musics. So before moving on, I do want to address the term griot, which I am not going to be using in this presentation. And if you leave here today with anything, I really hope to have convinced you to also maybe not use this word or hesitate to use this word. Griot is a French term. France was the major colonizer of the Mandé region. It has become a widespread term to refer to the kind of musicians and the kind of music making that I'm talking about today, because it really can refer to a similar group of musicians and music making practices, again, across a wide variety of ethnic groups in the Mandé region. So rather than refer to the ethnically and linguistically specific term locally, people representing Mandé music in the West have gotten into the habit of using griot as a catch-all term. Linguists who specialize in Mandé languages believe that the term came from a mispronunciation of the Wolof equivalent of a jeli, which is gewel. So we can imagine that French traders or colonizers heard the term gewel and francophonized that word by saying griot. However, in my research, several musicians have expressed their frustration with the term and a very different conception of the history. So for example, New York City-based and Gambian-born Jali Salyususo in a 2018 interview told me that, quote, Europeans were first introduced to the Arabs and the Arabs introduced them to the Africans. The way the Arabs called Africans black is like a sabotage. The word was gri-gri, which was monkey, which means monkey. So what he's explaining is that griot actually stems from an appropriation of the Arabic word gri-gri, which means monkey and has historically been used as a racial epithet for sub-Saharan Africans in Arabic. He went on to say that, quote, if you understand the beginning of, naming that term, sometimes you understand exactly the miscommunication. You feel like a sabotage. Yeah, sometimes you are sabotaged. And we Africans don't like the term. I don't believe in that term. It's a racial term, unquote. So contextualized historically this way, you can see how when jeliw hear this term, it signifies layers of colonial suppression and violence, and not just from the West. It's actually an even longer history of suppression and violence. So what are some of the alternatives to this term? So of course, ideally, the alternative to griot is the ethnically and linguistically specific term. However, of course, if there are 47 different ethnic groups and 47 different languages, it may not be feasible to memorize all of those different terms. So I highly recommend that if you come across a musician and you have the chance to talk to him or her, ask them what is his or her title in his or her community in West Africa, or how are musicians referred to where he or she comes from. In my experience, musicians are always really thrilled by curiosity and want to talk about the language and want to talk about the culture locally. So I think you'll have a lot of success. And if this is not possible, I would really encourage you to use the term jeli or jali, which are the Malinke and Mandinka terms respectively. Some of the most recognized terms in the region. And even if someone is not a jeli or jali, or not even the equivalent of that in their ethnic group, they'll typically take it as a compliment because it's a very highly recognized term across ethnic groups, and it denotes a very high level of musician. So I really hope that, when you walk away from this presentation, if you're talking about this music, you'll begin to use this term, which comes from these languages. All right, so who are the jeliw? So here we see a Wolof Borom or chief and his gewel, the Wolof equivalent of a jeli, with a halam, a kind of lute, pictured in Dakar in 1904. Jeliw are musicians, singers, instrument builders, genealogists, historians, and ... I've added that ellipses because the roles that they play throughout Mandé society really go on and on. People have often used the term bard to describe their contributions. However, in addition to singing praises to politicians or to telling stories in their songs, there's also a really big pedagogical element to what they do. They do epic recitation, which can take hours or days, that tell the history of the region, that explain about morals and language to young people. They also play in very important ceremonies such as baptisms or naming ceremonies or weddings and significantly funerals. And they're really seen as the kind of mediators of such significant events in life. So they really do play a lot of different roles in society and hold a lot of knowledge about the local region, its history, and its music. Jeliw serve jatigi or patrons. So that's what we're seeing in this picture to the left, sometimes intergenerationally. So that is to say that the children of a particular jali that serves a particular jatigi may go on to be the jeli and jatigi to one another. So you actually have families that are bound by this relationship of the musician and the patron over time. That is less present today. You don't see that as frequently. Patronage systems have really changed as a result of political change, but historically that has been the case, and every now and again you still see that in the West African context. So significantly, jeli are part of the Nyamakala caste in Mandé society, which means that they wield nyama or dangerous forces. And this distinguishes them from their horon or noble-born and John, slave-born counterparts by dalilu, which are spiritual powers. These spiritual powers, dalilu, are passed down by fasia or patrilineage. And that's really kind of at the heart of the difference that jeli the jeli role has in comparison to, say, leaders and chiefs, and then also laborers within Mandé society. Nyamakala caste also includes a variety of other artists and artisans, such as soralu, hunter musicians, and numulu blacksmiths, who are also music makers. So not every single type of artisan is a music making artisan, but there are other types of artisans, right, within the Nyamakala that also make music. And one of the really significant things about music and about the way that it wields these dangerous forces is that it is necessary, for example, in hunters' music, to deal with the spiritual release that comes from death when you hunt something, but also in the death of a hunter. So this is sort of how significant and how important these musical traditions are viewed in terms of their relationship with the natural and spiritual environments. So some of the jeli instruments at the Met include the halam, which is the Wolof word for this kind of lute. The Wolof have been historically located in the northwestern part of present-day Senegal, and Wolof is now the dominant language of Senegal. This lute is similar to many found in the region, whose name in Maninka is Ngoni. Both of these halams in the Met's collection are from the late 19th century. Another set of instruments is the kora, which is one of the newest instruments of jeli tradition in the region, likely created sometime in the mid-18th century. Although the kora is a jeli instrument, it is very much closely related to a variety of hunters' harps in the region, very similar instruments with just fewer strings. The kora is closely associated with the Kabu Empire, which was an offshoot of the Mandé Empire, and closely associated with the Mandinka, which became a prominent group in Guinea, southern Senegal, and the Gambia. On the left is a kora from 1960, and on the right is a kora from the 19th century. And finally, the bala, which is a kind of xylophone, is perhaps the most important instrument of the jeli tradition, whose history I will turn to shortly. This bala in the Met's collection is from the 19th century. So just a note on how these instruments are built. Traditionally speaking, the oral traditions, the songs, the repertoires would be passed down from father to son within these families. And once you had come to a certain level of learning to play, typically on your father or your uncle's instrument, you would have a chance to build your own. And any of these instruments would take about a month to build. They're very involved processes, and that would most likely, not always, but a lot of times be your instrument for life. And so in a variety of African languages, and not just Mandé languages, this is actually true throughout West Africa, certainly, the word for mastering your instrument is actually the word for mothering your instrument, because when you come to a certain level and you've arrived at the phase where you've been given permission to build your own instrument, you really are giving birth to the instrument. And it's even given a baptism. It's also then often married to the practitioner. So it's a very kind of strange relationship in that way. But nevertheless, if you think about what mastery entails in this circumstance, it's really interesting that there's a analog to motherhood and to giving birth to the instrument again, or perhaps a rebirth to the instrument again. So, history of the jeli role. The history of jeli and their practices can be divided into 5 periods, namely the pre-Mandé period, so the period before the Mandé Empire, the period during the Mandé Empire, the period of Atlantic trade, the colonial period, and the post-colonial period. I'm going to talk about all 5 of these in brief, with less attention paid to the period of Atlantic trade. This is, of course, the period when there was significant slave trade, and the lower classes, namely the Nyamakala and Jon, which is to say artisans and slave-borns, were the most heavily subjected to the slave trade and There's no way around that. It's hard to, there are some very hard limits on what we can say about how the culture fared at that moment. And there is a really significant rupture between what we can say about the Mandé period and what we can say about the post-Mandé period as a result of the Atlantic slave trade. So there's significant loss there, and there's also a significant ignorance about what the tradition looked like at that moment in time, in which there was a lot of political fracturing that was really perpetuated by the slave trade. So starting first with the pre-Mandé period, jeliw placed the origins of their practice in Surakata, the companion to the Prophet Muhammad. Rooting their tradition in Islamic history corroborates the view that it likely stems from the period the Ouagadougou or Ghana Empire was in power. So that's 900 to 1200 AD, located in the south of present-day Mauritania, which is very important because a lot of people do mix up these empires with their present-day geography, and the Ghana Empire was notably quite far from present-day Ghana. And it was at this time that the Ouagadougou Empire rose to power that Islam was brought into the region via Middle Eastern trade routes. And so when folks say that their tradition comes from Surakata, they're actually naming a time period in which Islam arrived, and probably the musical traditions actually felt recognizable to the narrative around Surakata and Muhammad, and were made to fit into that kind of relationship. So during the Mandé period from 1235 to 1469 AD, Jeli and Jatigi, so again, musician and patron relationships, really matured in keeping with a blueprint set by Bala Faseke Kouyaté, previously Jimo Dua, and the founder of the Mandé Empire, Soundiata Keita. So on the right, you see an illustration of the origin of the Bala with Jimo Dua, who discovered it with the aid of a jinn. And when he had really come to master or mother the instrument, Soundiata Keita came upon him and realized the real potential that this amazing musician had for him politically. And he became Jimo Dua, who he named Bala Faseke Kouyaté. He made him his voice, essentially. He said that basically Bala Faseke Kouyaté would give voice to his political aspirations, to his accomplishments, to the history of his reign. And since then, men of power in the region have kind of taken after that relationship and taken in musicians to tell their stories, to educate about their genealogies, and to also voice political concerns. So this is the time that epic recitation techniques develop. And it's also when songs begin to not only sing praises, which is much older than the Mandé period, but also tell the history and genealogies of Jatigi or patron families. And just a note on Soundiata Keita, his impact and his and Bala Faseke Kouyaté's impact on what it means to be a jeli and what jeliya is really reflected in how popular of a figure he is in jeli recitation. Pretty much anyone who plays any of the instruments I've mentioned knows a song that is about Soundiata Keita, and there are just numerous transcriptions of Soundiata as recited over hours and sometimes days by various jelis up until the present. So now the Atlantic trade and colonial period. So between 1530 and 1555, the Wolof, were the coastal group in northern Senegal, begin trading progressively with the Portuguese, French, and British. In 1862, the French found Dakar, much to the chagrin of the local Lebu population. In 1879, the Portuguese colonized the Guinea-Bissau region just south of Senegal. In 1880, the French formalized colonial rule across the Mandé region, and in 1889, the British colonized the Gambia, such that in 1897, this is what the map of the region looks like, with the purple regions signifying French colonial rule, pink signifying British rule, and the green signifying Portuguese rule. In the late 19th to early 20th century, musical instruments begin to appear in Western collections, which is a really new development. As I said previously, traditionally people have a very personal relationship with their instrument. They would only really build it for themselves. And so the idea of it entering into a trade is certainly a new thing at this period. This was more often than not likely unwilling. These instruments were banned and confiscated by both colonial regimes and missionaries. And so they were likely really removed from the region rather than given away or traded, although we don't know exactly the circumstances that they were brought into the West. And then in the early 20th century, you begin to see images arriving in Europe in particular depicting jeliw. And this was a very, very popular postcard at the beginning of the early 20th century that's in the Met's collection. That's a very interesting history. There was a fellow at the Met named Giulia Paoletti, did a very interesting project on this. And so the musicians really actually made up a very significant part of the iconography that represented Africa in Europe at this time. Finally, it's beginning in the 1930s, you have the first ethnographic recordings made. Those first recordings were made by Laura Bolton, and the collection of those recordings are actually at Columbia University. There's also part of that collection at Indiana University and the Smithsonian. And from this period on is when you begin to actually have recordings out of the region and coming to the West. So in the post-colonial period, and I'm starting a little bit before the end of colonialism, 1950s and 1970s, ethnographic recordings really pick up. And one of the most prolific recorders or producers of these recordings at this time was Gilbert Roger, an ethnomusicologist from France who was working at Musée de l'Homme. He made most of his recordings in Guinea, but he worked throughout the region. And just so you get a sense of what these recordings sound like, I'm just going to play an excerpt of a trio of bala players that appeared on a 1999 reissue of 1952 recordings made in Cancan, Guinea by Rouget. And it also features these musicians' wives singing and playing percussion. So let's just take a listen to this. So that's a kind of song that we play at celebrations, harvest celebrations specifically, but also marriages, and a little bit of a sense of the textures and the sounds and the quality of these ethnographic recordings at this time. But in addition to these ethnographic recordings, this was also a really prolific period for national ensembles and conservatories, which were established both before and after independence, and actually very much helped in the anti-colonial effort. The most famous of these was Les Ballets Africains de Ketofogdeba from Guinea, who, in addition to releasing a number of commercial recordings, also toured Europe and the US. And I believe they traveled the US in the early 60s, making them the first jeliw musicians to arrive in the US to perform live. So independence is established around 1960, and from 1960s onward, you have an influx of commercial recordings, predominantly from across the Black Atlantic into the region. So that is to say, a number of salsa and soca and jazz and soul records start to arrive in West Africa and really have a big impact on the music practices and tastes of people locally. You also have the progressive visibility of jeliw on the world music circuit, which I will turn to now. So some of the first really big recordings to circulate that were produced in the Mandé region were produced by national initiatives. Either they were national ensembles or they were produced on nationally sponsored record labels. Most famous of these is Sylvan Records, which was in Guinea and started by Sekou Touré. And one of the most famous artists to come on Sylvan Records is Kouyaté, who is a really amazing voice, and I highly recommend looking him up after this. Sylvan Records has a particularly dark history, in part because it was part of a greater diplomatic effort on the part of the dictator Sekou Touré, who managed to really garner a lot of diplomatic credibility and was visited, one of the first countries, one of the first leaders visited by a number of Western presidents, including JFK. And at the same time, he was implementing what he called a black diet against ethnic groups that he viewed as political enemies. So it's really actually quite impressive that he was able to receive the endorsement of countries outside the West while actually implementing really, really draconian policies. And he was able to do this in part because of the cultural perception of Guinea, which was proliferated by records such as Sylvan Records. Then you have Sunjulu Sissoko of Senegal, who is a really interesting figure. You can see him here. It says Roi de la Kora, so the king of the Kora. He was the favorite Kora player of poet President Leopold Senghor, first president of Senegal, who famously wrote in the national anthem to citizens to pick up their koras and pluck them, which is sort of a strange thing to say for an instrument that was historically relegated to a certain caste of people. So he really looked to Sunjulu Sissoko to democratize access to the instrument. At the same time, Sunjulu Sissoko is a very rare musician because he's Catholic. And at that time, it's very rare to have Catholic musicians. But one of the reasons why he was favored was precisely because of his Catholicism, because Senghor was also a Catholic. So there is certainly some tension amongst Senegalese kora players for the ways in which Sunjulu Sissoko became a star for that reason. And finally, you have Bazumana Sissoko, who is an Ngoni player from Mali, who is blind. He's from the Segu region, who really actually, unlike Kouyaté or Sunjulu Sissoko, who were doing a lot of outward diplomacy for their nation states, was actually really more of the voice of the nation. And he had a radio show where he would play for an hour almost every evening, and people would listen to it. And it was really something that all Malian people shared. And so it was viewed as a very important national effort to kind of keep him as a large figure on the radio because people really loved his music. So let's just listen to a little excerpt of him playing now. so you can get a sense of the sound and the aesthetic a little bit, which is going to be important because I'm about to compare it to more recent releases. So I'm calling these releases neo-traditional. You can see these are much more recent records released on mostly actually British labels, namely World Circuit. I call them neo-traditional because they are playing traditional jeliw instruments. So this 1999 release, New Ancient Strings, is perhaps the most famous, certainly the most famous kora recording out of the region. The second is an Ngoni, a group of Ngoni players, famously Baseku Kuyate plays with his whole family. So he's got like, I think 4 sons who play different size of Ngonis, and his wife sings. And then finally, Lasuna Diabate, who is a bala player, all of whom are from Mali. And they all play this traditional repertoire on these albums. However, I say neo-traditional in part because the sound has really changed as a result of Western production, in part. One of the major hallmarks of this change is the move from the indigenous scales to the closest Western scale. This has been seen on just about all of these instruments, that the pieces have been changed slightly to fit into Western temperaments. Finally, you have a much clearer production on these records and a much wetter sound. So a little bit more reverb, a little less staccato, a little less gritty. So I'm just going to play a clip of Baseku Kuyate's recent release, Miri. And I hope you can hear kind of a little bit of those qualities compared to the Bazumana Sissoko recording. So let's listen to this. So I hope you can hear a little bit of the change from Bazumana Sissoko, who, like Baseku Kuyate, is from Mali. They're from very similar regions of the world and playing the same instrument, but of course the sound is completely different, even though they're both playing traditional repertoire. And I say this not because, oh, it's, you know, such a shame it's changed, but rather that these traditions are very, very flexible, very malleable, and are changing all the time. And so, you know, I think we tend to think that these things are ancient and have remained the same, when in fact, even within a period of, you know, 50, 60 years, we can really hear pretty significant changes in the tradition itself. But all that said, there are a lot of players playing these instruments outside of the traditional repertoire. And I just highlighted here a few different collaborative releases. So notably Yakuba Sissoko, who you may have heard at the Met, because he does play there from time to time. He was featured on African-American jazz violinist Regina Carter's 2010 album Reverse Thread. Similarly, Saliu Suso was featured on the 2012 jazz album, the African Nubian Suite, led by pianist Randy Weston. And finally, just a few years ago, Trio de Kali, a very traditional trio of balafon, voice, and ngoni, did a collaboration with Kronos Quartet. So we do see people using these instruments and techniques of making music and really fusing them into a variety of different genres and trying to, I think, maybe surpass expectations of what these instruments can do and where they perhaps should be played. So that's always very exciting and cool to see. And so finally, just wrapping up, you know, I've really highlighted a very long history. So we're talking about, you know, 800, maybe even 1,300 years of history with these instruments and these traditions. And of course, there's a lot change. But at the same time, one of the most really remarkable things about these traditions is that people have these histories, have knowledges of the genealogies that go along with them. And so Bala Faseki Kuyate, who was the first Bala player, you will see the same name on a Bala player today. So this is Bala Kuyate, who lives in Massachusetts, who's a really tremendous player, who can really trace generationally the balafon players before him back to the first Bala player. And similarly with Kora, the first Kora player was known as Jalimadi Wuleng Sissoko. He's often referred to as the Griot Rouge, as on this album cover. And then you have Balake Sissoko, one of the most famous Kora players at the moment, who of course can also do the same thing, which is trace his lineage back to the original Kora player. And so if you begin to get a sensitivity for the names, some of the most popular names are Kuyate, Sissoko, Suso, Jabate. You start to get a sense of where these instrumentalists, where these jeli come from, to whether they are linked to that original line or not, and if so, which line they're linked to, which is a really exciting thing. So you see people changing the tradition a lot, but there's always that link back, which is really a very exciting thing about the tradition. But all that said, you also see the name Keita very, very commonly. So Salif Keita is a very famous singer from Mali. You also have Sekou Keita, who is a very well-known Kora player in the UK. And if you might remember, Sunjata Keita was the king of Mali. So of course, that's a noble-born name that as a result of the nationalizing efforts of these traditions, they became more accessible. And so people who were noble-born did have access to these traditions, to learning these traditions. So they've certainly opened up a lot more. And that's not true of every player who's from this region. They're not all from jeli families. But if you start to get a little bit of sensitivity to the names and the languages, you really can trace these traditions back hundreds and hundreds of years. So that's really quite an exciting element of it. So that's about all I have for today. I hope that this was rich for you, and I'm really looking forward to your questions.